let's move to Churchill to learn what we can about word power from his speeches and the way he went about preparing them. Now, as I said, Churchill was not only a great political leader, he was a leading historian of his era. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature and authored dozens of books, including the 4-volume series, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And in that 4th and final volume, which he entitled The Great Democracies, it covered the time period from 1815 to 1902, which meant that a large portion of it covered the American Civil War. And the greatest hero of the American Civil War was Lincoln. And so Churchill had totally studied everything there was to know about Lincoln, and in particular his speeches, as he was writing his history, and he was picking up Lincoln's tips. So why was Lincoln such a hero? Because Churchill knew he gave magnificent orations with a calm, massive, and magnanimous words about the importance of pursuing the anti-slavery cause. And it were these orations that elevated Lincoln above everybody else throughout the Civil War. And Churchill studied the Lincoln-Douglas transcripts as well as Lincoln's speeches. Whatever worked well for Lincoln would probably work for him. So like most geniuses, Churchill started young. He established himself as a communications prodigy at age 23. He never graduated from college. And by age 23, he wrote an essay titled The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. And in it, he said, of all the talents bestowed upon men, none is as precious as the gift of oratory. He who wields it, he who enjoys it, wields a greater power than that of a great king. He is an independent force in the world. So this scaffolding of rhetoric had 5 parts, and they worked for him throughout his life, and they can work for you. Scaffolding board number 1. Look familiar? Word, choice, precision, just like Lincoln, using short words and often old words that Churchill thought had more power. He believed that an exact appreciation of words ensured that the speaker would engage in, quote, the continued employment of the best possible word. And to show how insistent Churchill was on precise word precision, his valet once exclaimed to him, "Sir, you're sitting on your water bottle. That's not a good idea." And Churchill calmly replied, "Idea? It's not an idea. It's a coincidence. It's an accident." Thus, he was a stickler for word precision, no matter what the circumstances were. So he favored short words. And I would encourage you, whenever you're preparing a draft of your next presentation, when you examine every word, invariably, a 3-syllable word, you can find a better 2-syllable word and probably even a better 1-syllable word. Those are the words that have impact. Lincoln's second inaugural address, over 702 words, over 500 of them were 1-syllable. Think about it. Someone once complimented Churchill on the high percentage of 1-syllable words in a speech that he gave in January 1940. He said, "Short words are best, and old words, when short, are even better." For example, when he gives speeches, he didn't talk about the enemy. He talked about our foe. He also said, instead, "Please explain," he would say, "Pray explain." Something about these old words had more resonance. And so he knew that, and he chose his words accordingly. Now here's here's another example of how Churchill would use word power and precise word to maximize his impact. When a reporter once asked him the most important thing that a politician needed to have, here was Churchill's answer, obviously tongue-in-cheek. The most important trait for a politician is, quote, the ability to predict exactly what's going to happen tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. And then to have the ability to explain afterwards why what you predicted did not happen. That's called anaphora. Next week, next month, next year. So besides anaphora, there's other ways to have rhythmic, impactful speech. For example, create sentences that play off each other using opposite extremes. Here are two examples of Churchill's doing that, explaining the difference. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. This is the second point, rhythmic sentences, which I just gave. And everything I've said about Churchill, one of your women on the staff said, where do I get my information? Andrew Roberts wrote this book that came out in 2018. I hope many of you read it. Churchill, Walking with Destiny. And both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal said, this is the best single-volume biography of Churchill that's ever been written. So if you're interested in Churchill and you want the best single volume, read this, and this is the source of my points here. But here's another example of him using anaphora, his famous speech to the House of Commons. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the landing grounds, on the fields, in the streets. We shall fight in the fields. We shall never surrender. Repetition. We shall fight. We shall fight. We shall fight. You heard Martin Luther King. You heard Cicero. This is what the great orators do. Don't be afraid of doing it. But here was him using rhythm in another context. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of misery. Another example, in describing one of his predecessors, British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, Churchill said, we know that, more than any other man, MacDonald has the gift of compressing the largest amounts of words into the smallest amount of thought. So as you're preparing a speech and you think you're in your final draft, read it aloud, let somebody else hear it. Does it have rhythm that's going to pick up the audience's ear? The third scaffolding board, build arguments that gain momentum. Churchill said that the power to persuade comes from the steady accumulation of argument, bringing forward a series of facts that all point in the same direction. One of his most famous speeches after World War II, he'd stepped down as prime minister. He went to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, at Harry Truman's invitation, I believe, and gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. Now, this is 1 year after the end of World War II, and in that 1 year, during World War II, the Soviet Union had been our ally. Once World War II ended, all of a sudden, Stalin decided he wanted to take over the world. And so in this speech, he told the crowd, and of course it went viral nationally, that everybody need to rethink their perception of our former allies, the Soviets. And he said exactly what they'd been doing since the end of World War I. In Italy, France, Germany, Poland, Turkey, Persia, Far East, boom, 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 momentum, country by country by country, building his argument, giving a wake-up call. Pay attention, folks. We got a new major problem on our hands. So ask yourself, when you're putting together your presentation, is it building momentum? Scaffolding board number 4, use analogies or metaphors to enhance and clarify the points you're making. Yes, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. So can a metaphor. Churchill said that when a speaker joins together 2 different images or circumstances, he can translate an established truth into something clearer and more engaging. Here's an example of Churchill's making his point more vividly by using a metaphor. trying to maintain good relations with a communist is like wooing a crocodile. You do not know whether to tickle it under the chin or beat it over the head. When it opens its mouth, you cannot tell whether it is trying to smile or preparing to eat you up. Now, how's that for a metaphor? You have a different and clear picture of the communist mindset? Do you use metaphors like that when you're speaking or writing? The fifth scaffolding board, from time to time, use extravagant words. They can elevate and inspire your audience. Churchill said sometimes, not always, but sometimes to maximize a speech's impact, it's fine to use wild extravagance of language because it arouses feelings of both the speaker and the audience and become the watchwords of the parties and the creeds of nationalities. Think about Franklin Roosevelt. Nothing to fear but fear itself. We must be the arsenal for democracy. Words that overwhelm. Today, a day that shall live in infamy. An example in Churchill's case came in May 1939 when he watched in dismay as Chamberlain and Halifax failed to check Hitler and Mussolini's aggression in Eastern Europe. And so Churchill ramped up his description of the threat by becoming a forceful prophet of doom if Britain kept failing to confront and turn back the Nazis. Quote, to submit to the Nazi encroachments would be to condemn a large portion of mankind to their rule, though to resist them, either in peace or in war, will be dangerous, painful, and hard. No one should go forward in this business without realizing plainly what the cost will be and what the issues are at stake. Now, to symbolize the fact that he used extravagant words, he used them successfully. When the war was over, people started referring to Churchill as the lion who roared. He said, it was a nation and a race dwelling all around the globe that had the lion heart. I was not the lion, but it fell to me to give the lion's roar. Extravagant words roar when used at the right time. Think of Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. So do your speeches, when you're getting to that point, do they roar? You might think about it. So let's review the 5 boards in Churchill's scaffolding of rhetoric. Be precise in your word choice using short, old words. Craft rhythmic sentences. Build arguments that gain momentum. Use analogies and metaphors to enhance and clarify. Use extravagant language that elevates and inspires. Now that we have this scaffolding, how do we use the 5 boards to build an architectural word masterpiece? Okay, we got the scaffolding, but you got to turn it into a finished product. And for Churchill, there were no shortcuts. Number 1, relentlessly edit drafts and repeatedly rehearse your speeches. With each pass-through, Churchill knew, and everybody who's written or given many speeches knows, every time you do it again and again and again, it just gets better and better and better. The analogy I always use, it's like a screwdriver. Every time you go through it, with every twist, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. For years, some of you know, I wrote a column for the Park Cities People, and my word limit was always 600 words. And my first draft was always 1,000 words. And so I had to go through several drafts to cut 400 words. But man, when it was finished, it was as tight as I could make it. And that was Churchill's approach. And often he said, I'm going to have to make a long speech because I don't have time to prepare a short one. And when it comes to giving presentations, remember, less is more. Here's how Churchill defined verbosity. It is sheer laziness, not compressing thought into a reasonable space. So ask yourselves, how many rounds of editing do you do? Thank God we're on computers. Think of every new draft you had to start from scratch. But keep processing until you know it's as tight as you can get. And a reporter once went to Churchill's home the day before he was going to give a major speech. And here's was the reporter's comment, quote, "All day long, Sir Winston could be heard booming away in his bedroom, rehearsing his facts and his flourishes to the accompaniment of resounding knocks on the furniture." His practicing for a speech was so intense and focused that he often would work all through the night. He couldn't stop until he was satisfied that this is as good and powerful as I can make it. So when you give speeches, are you rehearsing them several times to make sure they're as good as you can make it? Another way that he transformed his scaffolding into a masterpiece was nothing but the truth, always. Andrew Roberts said he leaned and had learned this at the foot of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who said, "Trust the people. They can hear the worst kind of news so long as it's not put in a demoralizing way." And he did that. During World War II, one of his lieutenants, Harold Nicholson, made the point that, quote, "I must say, he does not try to cheer us up with vain promises. Don't we wish we had presidents who didn't give us vain promises, who tried to tell us the truth? Wouldn't they have a whole lot more credibility?" And his secretary, Leslie Rowan, wrote, "Churchill hated civil servants' polite but insincere remarks that were designed to please." The third way that he transformed his scaffolding into a masterpiece was, again, Lincoln, match the content to the audience. And with each audience, there's a certain way of having pizzazz. Make it have a little extra buzz. I call it snap, crackle, and pop. That's really going to make the audience smile. And Churchill did this by knowing, I'm here to educate, but I'm also here to entertain. What are the three lessons in public speaking? Be interesting, and be interesting. If you're not, nobody's ever going to hear a word you got to say. So to be interesting, Churchill would sprinkle humor, alliteration, scripture, Shakespeare, poetry throughout his speeches. These were bells and whistles, made people, wow, hadn't thought about that before. For humor, Churchill knew what worked, for one thing, and George W. Bush was particularly good at this. He knew self-deprecation worked. He gave a speech after, World War II. He got a lot of honorary degrees. He went all over the place. And when he received his honorary degree at the University of Miami, he delighted the crowd by saying, "I am surprised that in my later life, I should have become so experienced in taking degrees when as a schoolboy, I was so bad at passing examinations." Self-deprecating humor is great. So poke a little fun at yourself and watch the audience respond. Another way, alliteration. Play on words. Give his word picture a little extra color. In a speech after the London Blitz, here's how he expressed his contempt for Hitler. "We will have no truce or parley with you or the grisly gang who work with your wicked will." So when he gave this famous speech that I mentioned earlier about "we will fight them on the beaches, we'll never surrender," he threw a little alliteration at there afterwards. He said, "and we'll fight them with the butt ends of broken beer bottles because that's bloody well all we've got." Notice how the alliteration makes it come alive. Knowing that most Brits in his era, no longer unfortunately, were churchgoers, he would sometimes inject scripture into his remarks. In 1938, as he wrote of Hitler's rising threat and recognized that if Europe was going to defeat Hitler, England couldn't do it by itself. It was going to have to join up with other European countries, essentially become a United States of Europe. But Britons, being Britons, didn't want that officially. They always wanted to maintain their separateness and their independence. So here was the way Churchill explained it to the people, playing off of 2 Kings chapter 4. He said, look, we are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not compromised. We are interested and associated, but not absorbed. And should European statesmen address us in the words which were used of old, wouldst thou be spoken for to the king or the captain of the host? We should reply with the Shunammite woman, I dwell among my own people. So as with alliteration, plugging in scripture to fit the audience and the circumstances can impress and dazzle them. He also could spice up his speeches by using poetry and Shakespeare. He had this sponge-like brain. Whatever he read, it stayed with him. He memorized it. And so he could work into his speech Shakespeare and Byron and Tennyson and even Longfellow. And besides that, he also would work into his speech from time to time history. Here's where we are now. You know our history. Here's what we're doing now compares to our past. During a radio broadcast in the midst of the London Blitz, here's what he told the British people, encouraging them, knowing that they were going to have to be braver than their forefathers. Quote, today ranks with the days when the Spanish Armada was approaching the Channel and Drake was finishing his game of bulls, or when Nelson stood between us and Napoleon's grand army at Boulogne. What is happening now is on a far greater scale and of far more consequences to the life and the future of the world than these brave old days of the past. Every man and woman must therefore prepare themselves to do their duty with special pride and care. Do not let us speak of darker days. Let us speak rather of sterner days. These are not dark days. These are great days. And we must thank God that we've been allowed, each of us, according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable, the most memorable in the history of our race. So applying history to today can be very powerful. So to review how Churchill transformed his scaffolding into a masterpiece, relentless editing of his drafts, repeatedly rehearsing his speeches, speaking nothing but the truth all the time, and matching his contents to audiences, always using pizzazz. So there you have it, my friends, at University Park Methodist Church, a lesson on word power from Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill, the most eloquent, brilliant communicators of the last 200 years, who did their best to use every note in the human voice as if playing an organ. Admittedly, none of us in this room has their level of brilliance, their level of eloquence, but by golly, we can sure learn their best practices and do our best to apply them. And if you do, watch how your word power will surge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's not on.
You want to use this one?
Thank you so much, Talmage. That was fabulous. We really look forward to your book coming out before the 2024 election.
All right, I'm gonna make a little plug for it. It's actually, I've got to have it turned in by January 31, 2023. And it's hopefully going to come out in the fall of 23, well before the 24 elections. But the title of the book is How the Best Did It, subtitle, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. 8 chapters, 8 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. And what I'm doing is discerning the most important leadership traits that each of those 8 presidents had, in hopes that whoever is currently or aspiring to be a leader, whether in business, in your church, in a nonprofit, wherever you are or aspire to lead, can recognize, here's what made George Washington great that might work for me, or Theodore Roosevelt, or Eisenhower. And at the end of each chapter, I have kind of a workbook of questions that pertain to the leadership traits for that president, and asking you to ask yourself those questions about how you're doing on those traits. And over the course of the 8 presidents, there's no repetition of traits. I mean, I could have George Washington, yes, I talked about his integrity. I didn't need to talk about Lincoln's integrity. So it's each of them has distinctly different leadership traits that hopefully will be of use to you. I don't know how many of you watch CNN, but John Avlon, who's on the morning show every day, who's also a leading historian, written wonderful books on Washington and Lincoln, is writing my foreword. And so I'm excited about it.